Chicago's wind has a way of cutting straight through your soul. It doesn't just sting your skin, it reaches deep, as if reminding you that you're still alive, even when every part of you wishes you weren't. That's how every morning began for me. Under the Adams Street Bridge, where the rumble of passing trains mixed with the echo of my own thoughts. I used to wake up to the sound of alarms and city traffic from an apartment window 20 stories high. Now, I woke to the clatter of beer bottles and the whispers of other lost souls claiming their piece of concrete. Funny how life can turn so sharply that one day you're standing tall in an office suit, and the next, you're praying for someone to drop $1 in your cup. I was 38 when the world folded in on me. I had a wife, a daughter, and a job that paid enough to keep us warm. But layoffs came fast at the firm that winter. One bad month led to another, and then came the bottle. Drinking was my escape. First one glass, then a few, then nights lost in a blur of whiskey and regret. My wife, Rachel, begged me to get help, but I was too proud to admit I was drowning. By the time I realized what I'd become, the locks had changed, and my little girl's eyes looked at me like I was a stranger. I told myself I'd bounce back, that Chicago was full of chances, but the city doesn't stop for broken men. Within weeks, I was sleeping on benches near Grant Park, carrying everything I owned in a backpack that smelled like rain and failure. The first winter was brutal. I remember a night in January when the wind howled through the alleys, and the snow came down so thick the whole world looked buried. I sat by a steam vent near Lower Wacker Drive, hands numb, trying to convince myself that I still mattered. People passed by, bundled up, eyes glued to their phones, and I realized something strange. When you're homeless, you don't just lose your home, you lose your name. Nobody says, "Good morning, David." Nobody says anything. You become invisible, a shadow between headlights. I started talking to God, even though I didn't believe in him anymore. "If you're real," I'd whisper into the dark, "why'd you forget me?" But the sky stayed silent. The stars over the city were faint, smothered by smoke and light, just like my faith. I started spending days near Union Station, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Anything helps." Sometimes people gave me $1, sometimes a smile. Other times they acted like I was a stain on the sidewalk. The worst were the ones who looked guilty, the ones who met your eyes but turned away fast, like they couldn't handle the reminder that comfort is fragile. I didn't blame them. I used to be one of them. I remember driving past men like me, shaking my head, thinking, how do you let yourself end up there? Now I knew. You don't fall all at once. You slip, inch by inch, until there's nothing to hold on to. Nights were the hardest. The city slept, but the streets never did. There were fights over food, police sirens, and the endless hum of the trains above. I'd lie there under the bridge, pulling my coat tight around me, staring at the flickering streetlight that never seemed to fully die out. It reminded me of my life, half lit, half gone, but still holding on. One night, I found an old Bible near a trash can behind a diner. It was wet from the snow, the pages curled and torn, but I took it anyway. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted something to hold. Inside the cover, someone had written, "He restores my soul." Psalm 23. I remember staring at that verse for hours. Restores my soul. My soul didn't feel like it could be restored. It felt abandoned, empty, forgotten. But still, I kept that Bible in my bag, like a relic of a faith I once had. On the nights when the cold was too much and the hunger twisted in my gut, I'd open it and read random verses under the flickering light. Sometimes I felt nothing. But sometimes there was a flicker, a warmth I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just memory. Or maybe it was God trying to whisper through the noise. There was one evening, just before Thanksgiving, when I sat outside a church on Dearborn Street. Families were going inside, laughing, their breath turning to mist in the freezing air. I watched them through the glass doors, the music, the warmth, the smiles, and something inside me broke. I pressed my forehead against the cold stone wall and whispered, God, if you can hear me, I don't want money. I don't want miracles. I just don't want to die alone. And for the first time in months, tears came. They weren't loud, just quiet, steady drops that felt like the city itself was weeping with me. That night, as I fell asleep on the alley, I didn't know that prayer had been heard, that God was already moving, already sending someone my way. But I would find out soon. And when I did, I'd realize that even in the streets of Chicago, even in the coldest corners of despair, God still walks, and sometimes He finds you where you've already given up.
It was a Sunday morning in late November. The kind of cold that makes your breath look like smoke and your bones ache from the inside out. I sat on the same corner near Clark and Jackson, my usual spot, watching people hurry past with gloved hands and steaming coffee cups. Church bells echoed down the streets, calling out to a world that no longer had a place for me. I had a half-empty cup of gas station coffee in my hands, but it was already cold. I remember thinking how strange it was to be surrounded by thousands of people, yet feel completely unseen. I was staring at my reflection in a puddle, the dirty water rippling with every passing car, when a voice broke through the noise. "You look like you've been fighting a war you didn't start." I looked up, squinting against the morning glare, and saw a man standing there. He was older, maybe in his 60s, African-American, with kind eyes and a short gray beard. He wore a faded army jacket and held 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I shrugged, not really caring, and he lowered himself onto the curb beside me like he'd been doing it his whole life. He handed me the extra coffee. It was hot. The steam hit my face and felt like a small miracle. For a while we didn't talk. We just sat there, 2 strangers in the wind, watching the city rush past us. Finally he said, "You got a name?" I hesitated before answering. "David." He smiled. "Nice to meet you, David. I'm Henry." We sat like that for a long time, just talking, or mostly he talked and I listened. He told me he'd served in the Gulf War, came back home to nothing, and lived on these same streets for 10 years before he got clean. "But you're not just a man who lost his way," he said. "You're a man who stopped believing he was worth saving." I didn't know how to respond to that. His words hit deeper than I expected. He looked straight at me and said, "You know, God doesn't just hang out in churches. He walks these streets too. You think you're lost, but maybe He's been waiting for you to stop running." I almost laughed. "You think God walks down Lower Wacker Drive?" I said bitterly. "Man, God left this city a long time ago." Henry didn't flinch. He just smiled. "That's what I used to think too," he said quietly, "until He found me right here, same spot you're sitting on." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross on a chain. It was worn, the edges smoothed by years of touch. "This," he said, holding it out, "was given to me by a pastor who used to feed us out here." I didn't believe him either. But one night, when I was too tired to live and too scared to die, I held this cross and told God, "If you're real, prove it." Next morning I woke up in the hospital. Some stranger had found me passed out in the snow and called an ambulance. That was the start of everything. He looked at me again. "You prayed last night, didn't you?" The question froze me. My throat tightened. I hadn't told a soul about that prayer, the one I'd whispered outside the church on Dearborn Street. I stared at him. "How did you—" "Because I did the same," he said. "And when you talk to God from a place so deep, He always answers. Maybe I'm your answer." I didn't know what to say. For the first time in a long time, I felt something move in me, like a faint warmth under all the layers of cold and shame. Henry stood up and said, "There's a mission shelter a few blocks down, on Van Buren. They serve dinner every night. You should come." I wanted to refuse. Pride, habit, fear, they all fought inside me. But something in his voice made me nod. "Good," he said, patting my shoulder. "And David, Don't quit before your miracle." Then he walked off into the crowd, disappearing as suddenly as he appeared. That night, I found myself outside that same mission. I stood there for 10 minutes debating whether to go in. Inside, I could see people eating, laughing, volunteers serving food with smiles that didn't look forced. I finally walked in. The warmth hit me like sunlight. They handed me a plate of hot stew and a blanket. As I sat down to eat, I noticed a small wooden cross on the table, identical to Henry's. I looked around for him, but he wasn't there. I asked one of the volunteers if a man named Henry came by. The woman frowned. "Henry?" she said. "We haven't had anyone by that name in months." My spoon froze midair. She smiled kindly. "But you're welcome here, son. Stay as long as you need." That night, I lay on a clean cot for the first time in years. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Henry, about his eyes, his words, the way he knew my prayer. And for the first time in a long time, I whispered, "Thank you, God." Not because everything was fixed, but because I knew, somehow, some way, I'd been found.
That night in the shelter was the first time I slept without shivering in nearly a year. The hum of the old radiators, the quiet snores of other men, the distant wail of sirens outside, it all felt strangely comforting, like the city was finally exhaling with me. Morning light crept through the dirty windows, washing over rows of weary faces, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't wake up with the urge to run. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Henry had been real, or if he was something else entirely. Maybe God really had sent him. Maybe angels wore army jackets and drank cheap coffee. When breakfast came, I ate like a man who hadn't tasted food in years. Afterward, a volunteer named Sarah sat across from me. She had that kind of warmth that makes you feel seen without saying a word. "You're new," she said gently. "What's your name?" I hesitated before answering, as if saying it aloud would somehow make me real again. "David," I said. She smiled. "Welcome, David. You're safe here." That word, safe, did something to me. It cracked something open inside that I'd buried under layers of guilt and shame. I started volunteering at the shelter after a few days, sweeping floors, helping in the kitchen, doing whatever I could. It wasn't much, but it gave me purpose, something I hadn't felt since the world fell apart. Weeks passed. The snow melted, and Chicago's gray streets turned to rivers of slush and light. Every morning, I'd look out the window at the skyline, that jagged line of glass and steel that once made me feel small, and I'd whisper, "Thank you." I didn't know why I said it, but the words came naturally, like breathing. One evening after dinner, Sarah invited me to join the chapel service they held in the back room. I didn't plan on staying long, I just wanted to sit in the warmth a bit. But as the small group began to sing, something shifted. The words of the hymn, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me," pierced straight through me. I hadn't cried since that night outside the church, but the tears came again, quiet and heavy. When the pastor began to speak, he said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes God doesn't rescue you from the storm. He meets you in it. Because if he pulled you out too soon, you'd never know who saved you." I felt like he was talking directly to me. That night, I stayed after everyone left, just sitting there under the dim light of the cross on the wall. "God, if you really found me, I'm here. I don't know how to start over, but I'll go wherever you lead." Life didn't change overnight. The scars of the streets don't fade that fast. But day by day, I got stronger. I joined a rehab program the shelter offered, started attending recovery meetings, and slowly rebuilt what I'd lost. Not the job, not the house, but myself. I started writing letters to my ex-wife, not to ask for forgiveness, but to tell her I'd finally found peace. A few months later, I got a small job at a diner washing dishes. It wasn't glamorous, but every plate I scrubbed felt like a step towards something sacred. People started calling me by name again,
"Morning, David." "Thanks, David." Each time, it felt like God whispering, "See? You were never forgotten." One spring afternoon, I walked past the corner of Clark and Jackson, the same spot where I met Henry. I looked for him every time I passed by, but he was never there. That day, though, I noticed something different. On the bench where we'd sat, there was a single paper cup, still steaming, though no one was around. I froze. My heart started pounding. I picked it up, and underneath it was a folded napkin with 3 words written in shaky handwriting. "Don't quit now." I stood there for a long time, the city swirling around me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the streets owned me anymore. I felt carried, like God himself had been walking beside me this whole time, through every bitter wind, every lonely night, every unanswered prayer. I didn't find him in a church or a sermon or a miracle that made the sky split open. I found him in a stranger's kindness, in a hot cup of coffee, and a small wooden cross passed from one broken soul to another. That's how he works, I think. Quietly, through the cracks of our despair, until light seeps through. Now, years later, I still walk those same streets, but not as the man I was. I go back to the shelter on Sundays, hand out coffee, talk to the ones sitting alone on the curb. Sometimes they ask me why I care. I smile and tell them the truth. Because once, God found me on these same streets, and he didn't let go.